Just keep swimming. Just keep swimming.
Let's play hide and seek.
Let's swim.
Yeah, I'll start counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Hey guys, what are those?
What? Where? What?
Up there.
Oh, cool.
They look like human feet. They're moving across the roof.
What? How are they doing that?
Better yet, why?
I don't know.
Look! There are 2 more of those feet things.
That one just showed his legs and his body and his arms.
Hey, they're gone. Oh. Well, let's play again. Okay.
Okay,
Swim.
I'm gonna start counting again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Ready or not, here I come.
All right, Casey.
Well, good morning. When Pastor Allison asked me to preach a sermon for this series, If Fish Could Talk, I have to admit that I was more than just a little bit excited. And I felt a little sorry for her. She came into my office and she said, "Could you preach a sermon during this series about talking fish?" And I was like, "Oh, yes, I can do that. I'm so excited." And then I told her the reason that I was so excited. And it is that when I was a kid, I had a talking fish. So I realize it sounds a little bit ridiculous. I thank you for the laugh track there. But of course, I don't mean to imply that my fish spoke actual words. That's just silly. But I really, truly did have a fish who communicated with me. I'm an only child, and only children need stories like this. So humor me. I got my free talking fish at a Meyer Kids Week event. And the story went that I was allowed to have the fish as long as we took it to my dad's friend's home where there was a pond. So we were going to release the fish in the pond. But I was about 7 years old, so of course we got to the pond and I began to cry about the fish, and I just had to take the fish home. And so my parents relented, and Lucky the fish, what else could he possibly be named, came home with us that night. Now, I taught Lucky to play with little rubber bouncy balls, and I taught him to jump through hoops, and I have all kinds of stories about this goldfish of mine. One day, we found Lucky on the kitchen floor because he got a little bit too excited about his jumping skills when no one was around. But I have to tell you, as it turns out, fish can come back to life if you get them in the water soon enough. Now, I would not recommend trying this at home. I have no idea what the time frame is. I don't know how long Lucky had been lying on the linoleum, but Lucky came back to life. Now, I understand that it all sounds a little bit crazy, but my fish would honestly come to the side of the bowl and he would move his little fishy lips and speak to me. And that, friends, is my big fish story. And then there's Peter. It's possible by the time we get to this story, Peter is suffering from big fish in a little pond syndrome. Now, there's a strangeness to this because Peter is actually something of a second chance, second career disciple. Turn your attention to this short video clip for an introduction to this idea.
A friend of mine gave me insight into the story about Jesus and his disciples that I'd heard before, but it's just taken on whole new meaning. Rabbis were the most honored, respected, revered people anywhere. I mean, the best of the best of the best are the only ones who got to be rabbis. And this rabbi comes down the beach and says to you, come follow me. Well, what's he really saying? What he's really saying is, I think you could do what I do. I mean, he's saying you can be like me. All of this, to me, has huge implications for how we understand Jesus. I mean, faith in Jesus is important, but what about Jesus' faith in us?
What about Jesus' faith in us? Wow. Now, if we were to go on and watch the rest of the video, we would learn that Peter's status as a fisherman is an indication that he was among those who did not make the cut for rabbinical training. The Jewish education system began with children who were around 6 years old, and they essentially entered school and they memorized the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah. They did this by the time they were 10. And then most children at that point went home and learned the family trade. That was the end of their education. But a select group went on to a second level of education where they learned more, they memorized more scripture. And then several years after that, a third group went on to the last level of education where they would apply to become the disciples of a rabbi. Now, the very concept of making an application tells us that even some of those kids were not chosen. The idea here was that the disciple would learn from the rabbi, which included knowledge for sure, but also practice. As Rob Bell would say, only the best of the best of the best were chosen to become like the rabbi. Now, somewhere along the line, Peter was kicked out of this process. And there wasn't any shame in this. That was the norm of the culture of the day. But we know that we would not have found Peter fishing with his brother if he had had what it takes to be a disciple. In addition, we know that Peter was well past the age when most people became disciples. That was typically 14 or 15 years old. But we know that Peter was married because we read about how Jesus healed his mother-in-law. So to have a mother-in-law, he must have been married. We know that Peter was required to pay the temple tax, and only adults were required to pay the temple tax. So Peter was probably in his early 20s. Many years had passed since he had hope of being a disciple. Yet he was chosen to be one of the 12. And not only that, he was one of the 4 that Jesus held closest to him. So it's a really big deal for Peter. Now, Jesus and Peter, they have this kind of banter between them throughout their time together. And Jesus renames Peter, claiming that the very church will be built upon him as the rock, as the foundation. But we also have many times when Peter questions, Peter doubts who Jesus is. And it's strange for a disciple to ask his rabbi over and over and over again, "Tell me who you are." But Jesus was, after all, a strange rabbi, and he took a huge risk with Peter. That's the backstory. So today we find the disciples in a boat as night is closing in. And it's important to recognize that they are not just sailing along carefree on crystal clear waters. In fact, the original word we translate to buffeted is actually closer to the word tormented. This storm is just as bad as the one that we heard about last week, and it might be worse. Based on the language and the cultural understandings of the day, the disciples probably actually believe that the storm has been caused by a disembodied spirit. So with that in mind, it's much easier for them to make the jump to, "It's a ghost," when they see Jesus walking on the water, than to believe it's actually Jesus. So it's important that Jesus is miles away the disciples are miles away from the storm when Jesus is walking to them. Jesus is not wading in the water. This is not any kind of natural or ordinary encounter. And when the fish look up, Jesus really is walking on their roof. Being who he is, Jesus immediately reassures the disciples. And I think we imagine him saying something like, "It's okay, guys. It's just me." But that's actually not what Jesus says at all. Jesus' declaration echoes the words, "I am Yahweh." It's just as God revealed himself to Moses in Exodus. And remember, these guys all have that memorized. So it's very meaningful to them to hear this. Maybe this is why Peter is impulsive enough to suggest he jump out of the boat. Now, Jesus, as the rabbi, has a goal in mind, which includes transforming his disciples, shaping them to be more and more like him. In some ways, we have to wonder if Jesus was saying to himself, "This is great. If Peter actually pulls this off, he's doing it. He's becoming like me." Because ordinarily, rocks don't float. And Peter seems to be having a similar reaction when he says, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you. Command me to come to you on the water." Even commentators are sometimes a bit baffled by this request, but I think it's because we get caught up in the phrase, "if it's you," and neglect to notice that Peter has already called Jesus Lord. Peter believes this is Jesus, his rabbi, and he wants to emulate what Jesus is doing. So there's a huge degree of commitment here because Peter is declaring that he's willing to follow Jesus and to become like him, not only when it's easy, not only when it's difficult, but also when it is impossible. And let's not miss the application for us in that. For Peter, it was enough that Jesus was who he said he was. Is that enough for us in order to take the first step out of our safety and comfort zones? In order to join Jesus on the surface of the sea in the midst of a storm? It's a huge question. We have no indication that any of the other disciples got out of the boat. Now, something that should be noted here is that Peter wasn't actually safe in the boat. With that in mind, the risk may have been less than we imagine. When your choice is between perishing in a boat that is being thrown about by ghosts or walking out on the water with Jesus, Peter may have made the logical decision. But this doesn't negate the fact that our illusions of safety often prevent us from doing good, right, risky things that would draw us nearer to our Lord. And this is where the story takes a turn. Up to this point, we have a misfit band of disciples doing misfit disciple type things, saying misfit disciple type things. "Ah, it's a storm. It's a ghost. Hey guys, we left Jesus on the shore hours ago. I wonder how he's going to catch up." And we have Jesus, who is Lord of all, doing Jesus type things. He dismisses the disciples, presumably so they can have Sabbath. He dismisses the crowds, maybe in hopes that he also will have Sabbath. He prays. Now he's walking on the water. But then Peter throws a wrench in this whole thing because he actually gets out of the boat. I read the following quote in a commentary as I was preparing this week, and it did not sit well with me. This is what it said, quote, "The climatic focus in this passage rests more with Peter's failure than with his accomplishment," unquote. I'd like to push back against that. I think the climax is when Peter's feet hit the water. I think this is the defining moment when Peter blurs this line between rabbi and disciple, between God and humanity. Interestingly, this ties in well with some teachings of Jesus that occur later in the Gospel of Matthew when the disciples are asking Jesus how anyone could be saved. Jesus speaks to the potential for accomplishing the impossible with God, and Peter answers him saying, "We have left everything to follow you. What then will there be for us?" We need to return to the idea that Peter may very well be the disciple who left the most. And I think we need to sit with that for a moment. Because Peter consistently comes to moments on his journey with Jesus when the overarching theme of his life seems to be, what do I have to lose? The lectionary gospel passage for today follows, and it's the story of the workers in the vineyard from Matthew chapter 20. I'm not going to read the whole thing right now. I read it on the radio this morning. I'm going to read it in my podcast this afternoon. But for the moment, I'm just going to paraphrase. You can find the entire story in verses 1 through 16. Jesus speaks to his disciples, and I think maybe especially to Peter, and he talks about the kingdom of heaven using a simile. The kingdom of heaven is like. Of course, this is typical of Jesus' teaching style. And in this case, he speaks of the kingdom in comparison to a landowner who goes out to hire workers for his vineyard. Some of these workers are hired early in the day and work for hours enduring the heat, perhaps like this week, probably worse. Some of these workers are hired a little later when the landowner goes out again and finds them standing around, doing nothing at lunchtime, and then again later in the afternoon. But the astounding thing is that the landowner goes out one more time when the workday is almost over, when it is almost too late. And he finds this group of people standing around and he asks them, "Why have you been standing here all day doing nothing?" Their response is, "Because no one has hired us." So he says to them, to even them, "You also go and work in my vineyard." And friends, that's Peter's story. It has to resonate. Last chance disciple, and the kingdom is like you. Drop the mic. But we've left Peter on the water probably longer than he actually was. When Peter gets out of the boat, his eyes are on Jesus. And he's not concerned about the water, it's the wind. Peter doesn't doubt Jesus here because if he did, his plea would surely not be, "Lord, save me." Peter doubts himself. Peter doubts his own ability to stand up against the storm that is raging around him and maybe within him. Jesus doesn't hesitate. He immediately reaches out to rescue Peter. And I think we imagine his next words as an angry, perhaps disgusted rebuke. "You have little faith. Why did you doubt?" If that's how Jesus said it, then the commentator was right. This passage, like his life, is all about how Peter is a miserable failure. But I don't think that's how Jesus said it. I think with tears in his eyes, Jesus looked at Peter, whom he is now carrying across the water and toward the boat. And Jesus is simultaneously calming the winds and the waves again. And I think Jesus said with compassion, "Oh, Peter, you were doing it. You got this. I've got you. Did you really think it would be any other way? Why did you doubt? Don't you know by now the last will be first and the first will be last?" And then they climb into the boat. And all the disciples look at this compassionate, merciful, powerfully loving Jesus and declare, "Truly, you are the Son of God. You are who you say you are." May we remember this as well and take some steps of faith.